Well, let's get more on this with our science correspondent, David Gregory-Kumar. Let's just pick up on that last point that Joan raised there. Can we see the impact of COVID in schools on wider infection rates?
Yes, we can use something called a website called the Local COVID Tracker, created by Dr. Michelle Kendall from the University of Warwick. She takes government data but puts it in a form we can really pull apart and look at it. So Joan was in rugby, let's say. Let's zoom in on what happens in rugby. And we get something called a spaghetti plot. It looks a little bit alarming, a bit like spaghetti. Every one of those lines is basically an age group and the number of people with COVID in that age group, with coronavirus rather. And at the end there, you can see they all stay fairly similarly together. And then right at the end, one of the lines leaps out of all of them and shoots right up. That is 10 to 14-year-olds in rugby. That is school-age children going back to school, catching coronavirus and spreading coronavirus. And it's more than enough to push rugby to the top of the infection rates in the Midlands and, frankly, almost the top nationally in England. Similar case in Stratford as well, you know, the other place Joan was in as well. So it's school kids driving this, but it's not the same effect everywhere. If we look at what's going on in Birmingham, same spaghetti plot. I know it looks a little bit alarming, but each of those lines, remember, is an age group. And there you go at the end. There's those 10 to 14-year-olds just starting to creep up at the end in Birmingham, but nowhere near the same kind of leap relatively that you see somewhere like rugby. So kids going back to school, 10 to 14-year-olds, is definitely driving all this, but the effect it's having is very different in some parts of the Midlands. So it's not as bad in Birmingham, say, as it is in rugby.
Which does lead me to ask, why is that?
I mean, that is a really good question. I've got a sort of hypothesis, an idea for you, and those plots can help us examine it. So if we put them back up, if Mel puts them back up for us, there we go. So look at rugby, very straight lines through the last year or so of the pandemic, number of cases. Birmingham, though, has had 2 big waves. And behind those waves, it's left behind some natural immunity in the population. And I think it's that natural immunity that's probably protecting kids going back to school in Birmingham to an extent. And so that's what happens, and that's why we're seeing such very different situations. What will turn it around there in rugby is mask wearing. We'll keep an eye on those plots over the next week or so and see what happens.
Fascinating. Thank you for unravelling that spaghetti. Thanks, David.